The richest man in the world died with $2,440 in his pocket. That was enough cash to buy a luxury mansion in 1912. But he was floating in the freezing Atlantic Ocean. His body was covered in black soot. His bones were crushed. This was John Jacob Astor IV, the Titanic richest passenger, whose death shocked the Gilded Age New York elite. The world watched in horror as the Astor family fortune, built over generations, faced its greatest test. But the freezing water of the North Atlantic was not what destroyed this empire. The true destruction of the Astor family history began with a single, bizarre legal clause hidden inside his last will. It was a clause so cruel, it forced his teenage widow to make an unconscionable choice. A choice that would ultimately tear America's first royal family apart. Long before John Jacob Astor, Titanic became a symbol of tragedy. His ancestors laid a trap designed to protect their wealth at all costs, even if it meant destroying their own bloodline. To understand how they reached this point of absolute self-destruction, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to look at the man who started it all. The Astor story does not begin with gold-plated ballrooms. It begins with blood and animal grease. John Jacob Astor I arrived in Baltimore in 1784. He was a German immigrant with nothing but $25 and 3 flutes. He quickly realized that the real money was not in music, it was in fur. He bought pelts from Native Americans for pennies. He sold them to wealthy Europeans for massive profits. He was ruthless. He traded whiskey and firearms for beaver skins. He established a total monopoly over the American fur trade. He did not care about the lives destroyed in the process. He pushed his trappers deep into the wilderness, establishing trading posts that stretched to the Pacific Ocean. He crushed competitors with brutal efficiency. He built a private empire that operated outside the law. When the fur market began to dry up, he did not panic. He pivoted. He began smuggling opium into China. He made millions of dollars from the addiction of millions of people. He shipped tons of Turkish opium into Canton, exploiting legal loopholes and bribing officials. He took that dirty money and looked at a map of Manhattan. He saw something no one else did. He saw that the future of wealth was not in trading goods. It was in owning the dirt people walked on. But his next move would change the rules of capitalism forever. John Jacob Astor bought Manhattan land when it was still covered in swamps. He bought goat farms. He bought empty fields. Then, he did something incredibly cynical. He refused to build on it. Instead, he invented the ground lease system. Think of it as a legal trap. Astor would lease his land to builders for 21 years. The builder paid for the construction. The builder took all the risk. But if the builder missed a single payment, Astor took the building for free. If the lease expired, Astor took the building anyway. He owned the dirt, and the dirt always wins. By the time he passed away in 1848, he was the wealthiest man in America. His fortune was worth $20 million. That was 1/15 of the entire United States Treasury at the time. His descendants did not have to work, they just had to collect rent. They became the landlords of New York. They controlled the very air the city breathed. But as the family grew, so did their hatred for one another. And soon, a petty family feud would carve New York City in half. This massive fortune was not just a bank account, it was a weapon that successive generations of Astors used against the city and eventually against each other. The money accumulated in silent trusts, multiplying with every rent check paid by the working class of Manhattan. They lived in palaces. They ignored the misery of the slums that sat on their own land. But wealth without purpose breeds a specific kind of rot, a rot that begins in the mind and spreads to the bloodline. By the late 19th century, the family had split into warring factions. Cousin fought cousin for social dominance. They built spite walls. They demolished historic landmarks just to block their relatives' views. And at the center of this golden storm was John Jacob Astor IV. He was the golden child. He was the inventor. He was the man who thought he could outrun his family's curse. But he was about to make a fatal mistake. A mistake that would lead him directly to the deck of a sinking ship and trigger the execution of the most devastating legal clause in American history. To get his pregnant teenage wife back to New York, John Jacob Astor IV made a decision that would end his life. He booked passage on the ultimate symbol of Gilded Age arrogance, the Titanic. The ship was marketed as unsinkable. It was a floating fortress of steel and luxury. For the Astors, it was the only acceptable way to cross the ocean. They did not just book a cabin. They booked a massive first-class suite. The ticket cost over $4,000 at the time. In modern currency, that is more than $100,000 for a single voyage. They boarded at Cherbourg on April 10, 1912. They did not travel light. Their entourage included a personal valet, a lady's maid, a private nurse, and their beloved Airedale Terrier named Kitty. For 4 days, the Astors lived in a world of absolute privilege. They walked down the grand staircase. They dined on 10-course meals of oysters and roasted duck. They socialized with the absolute elite of global society. They believed they were masters of the universe. They believed their wealth protected them from the vulgar realities of the physical world. But nature does not care about bank accounts. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Atlantic Ocean delivered a brutal lesson in physics. The ship struck an iceberg. The collision was not a massive crash, it was a faint shudder. In the first-class smoking room, Astor barely noticed. When told the ship had struck ice, he reportedly joked that he had ordered ice in his drink, but this was ridiculous. He felt perfectly safe. The Titanic was, after all, a 45,000-ton fortress of steel. He returned to his suite. He told Madeleine there was no reason to panic. But by 1 o'clock in the morning, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The bow of the ship was visibly tilting downward into the black ocean. The air was freezing. The luxury liner was dying. Astor guided his young, pregnant wife to the boat deck. He remained calm. He was a man accustomed to absolute control. But on the deck of the sinking ship, his millions meant nothing. The crew was enforcing a strict rule: women and children first. Astor helped Madeleine into lifeboat number 4. He looked at the half-empty wooden boat. He asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller if he could join his wife. He pointed out her delicate condition. Lightoller refused. The rule was absolute. No men were allowed until all women and children were off the ship. Astor did not argue. He did not cause a scene. His Gilded Age breeding would not allow it. He asked for the lifeboat number. He wanted to find her later. He tossed his leather gloves to Madeleine. He took a step back. He was last seen standing on the starboard bridge wing, smoking a cigarette. The ship's lights flickered. Then they went out forever. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the Titanic broke in half and plunged beneath the waves. For days the world waited in agony. The press scrambled for news. In New York, the Astor family waited in silence. Then, the rescue ship Carpathia arrived. Madeleine was alive, but John Jacob Astor IV was gone. A search vessel, the Mackay Bennett, was sent to recover the bodies. On April 22, 1912, they found him. He was floating face up in the freezing water. His body was badly mangled. It was covered in black soot. Historians believe a falling funnel from the ship had crushed him. But even in death, his wealth was loud. In his pockets, searchers found a gold watch. They found a gold pen. They found a diamond ring. And they found $2,440 in cash. In 1912, that was a small fortune. It was enough to buy a comfortable home. In the middle of the Atlantic, it was just wet paper. His body was brought back to New York. He was buried in Trinity Church Cemetery. The city mourned the loss of its most prominent citizen. But the public grief was quickly replaced by a dark curiosity. Everyone wanted to know about the money. Astor was worth over $87 million. Today, that would be equivalent to several billion dollars. He had left behind a young widow, a teenage son from his first marriage, and an unborn child. When his last will and testament was read, the room went cold. Astor had designed a document that was less of a will and more of a financial prison. He had left his young wife Madeleine an incredibly generous inheritance. She was given a $5 million trust fund. She was given the keys to his massive Fifth Avenue mansion. She was given his luxury carriages, his yachts, and his staff. But there was a catch. A single, devastating clause was written into the text. A clause designed to control her from beyond the grave. It was a legal trap that would force the teenage widow to make a decision that would shock New York high society. To understand the scale of John Jacob Astor IV's wealth, you must look at how he spent it. He did not just buy houses. He built sovereign kingdoms. His estate in Newport, Rhode Island, was called Beechwood. It was a palace designed for one purpose: high society warfare. Here, the Astors hosted balls where the champagne flowed like rivers. The gardens were manicured by a small army of servants. The floors were imported Italian marble. But Beechwood was not enough. Astor wanted to leave an indelible mark on New York itself. So he built the St. Regis Hotel. He did not build it for profit. He built it as a monument to his own ego. It was the most luxurious hotel in the world. He insisted on installing a revolutionary air conditioning system. It was the first of its kind. He wanted to control the temperature of the air his guests breathed. He imported gold leaf from France to cover the ceilings. He hired world-renowned artists to paint murals on the walls. He spent millions of dollars on a whim, because he could. Then there was his yacht, the Nur Mahal. It was not a boat. It was a floating mansion. It was over 200 feet long. It required a crew of dozens just to keep it running. Astor used it to escape the suffocating rules of the New York elite. He would sail to the Caribbean, far away from the judgmental eyes of his peers. He was a man who believed that money could buy gravity itself. He believed he was immune to the laws of ordinary men, and for a long time, he was. But his divorce from Ava Lowell Willing shattered that illusion. In 1911, divorce was not just a legal process. It was a social death sentence. The public was outraged. The press was merciless. When he married Madeleine Force, a girl of 18, the outrage turned into pure hatred. She was younger than his own son, Vincent Astor. The age gap was 29 years. The newspapers called it a national disgrace. They were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. The only solution was flight. They boarded the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic, and fled to Egypt. In Cairo, they lived like emperors. They rented entire floors of the finest hotels. They rode camels past the pyramids. They bought priceless antiquities. Astor wanted to drown the scandal in a sea of luxury. He bought Madeleine rare jewels. He bought her exotic silks. They traveled up the Nile on a private steamer. It was a dream world. But reality always finds a way to break through. By early 1912, Madeleine was pregnant. The news changed everything. If the child was born in Europe, the New York elite would use it as ammunition. They would claim the child was a social outcast, an illegitimate heir to the Astor throne. The child had to be born on American soil. It had to be born in New York, under the Astor name, inside an Astor mansion. The return journey was not a choice. It was a strategic necessity. They traveled to Paris, then to Cherbourg. They needed a ship that matched their status, a ship that would make their triumphant return to New York undeniable. There was only one option: the RMS Titanic. On April 10, 1912, they boarded the floating palace. They did not travel light. They brought a mountain of luggage. They brought their private maid, Rosalie Bidois. They brought Astor's personal valet, Victor Robbins. They brought a private nurse, Carolyn Endress, to tend to the pregnant teenager. And they brought Kitty, their beloved Airedale Terrier. They booked parlor suites C62 and C64. It was the pinnacle of ocean luxury. The suites featured private promenades, fireplaces, and hand-carved mahogany furniture. The cost of their ticket was over $4,000. In modern terms, that is a small fortune. But to Astor, it was pocket change. He was the undisputed king of the ship. His fortune of $87 million was greater than the cost of the entire ship itself. He walked the decks with an air of absolute invincibility. He was surrounded by the ultra-wealthy, the Guggenheims, the Strausses, the Wideners. It was a floating Gilded Age club. They dined on caviar. They drank vintage champagne. They believed they were safe inside the greatest machine ever built by man. They believed the ship was unsinkable. This was the peak of the Astor Empire. They had beaten the scandal. They were returning home to claim their dominion. The child would be born. The dynasty would secure its future. But nature does not care about family trees. It does not care about bank accounts. As the Titanic sped through the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic, a towering wall of ice was waiting. and the golden cage the Astors had built for themselves was about to become a floating tomb. The public execution of John Jacob Astor IV did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. In 1909, his divorce from Ava Lowell Willing shattered the golden rule of the Gilded Age. In those days, a gentleman of his stature could keep a dozen mistresses in secret apartments. He could spend millions on illicit pleasures. But he did not dissolve a dynastic marriage. When he finalized the split, high society did not just whisper, they revolted. But Astor did not care. He believed his $87 million fortune made him untouchable. 2 years later, he proved his total contempt for New York society. At 47 years old, he married Madeleine Astor. She was 18. She was younger than his own son. She was a schoolgirl from a family of moderate means. The reaction was nuclear. The press hunted them with a ferocity never seen before. Journalists camped outside his mansion. They labeled the union a grotesque transaction. The clergy of New York stood in unison against him. Respectable ministers flatly refused to perform the wedding ceremony. Astor had to search for weeks, eventually finding a desperate Congregationalist minister in Rhode Island, whom he paid a massive sum to perform the rites. That minister was defrocked by his own church within days of the wedding. The doors of New York's elite slammed shut. The social registry erased Madeleine's name. The grand mansions of Fifth Avenue went dark whenever the couple approached. To escape this suffocating hostility, the newlyweds fled to Europe. They spent the winter of 1911 and 1912 traveling through Egypt and Europe. They lived like emperors. They rented private steamships on the Nile. They bought ancient relics. But no amount of gold could buy their way back into the good graces of New York. Then, everything changed. Madeleine became pregnant. This was not just a personal milestone. It was a massive financial crisis. Under the ruthless legal framework of the Astor dynasty, an heir born on foreign soil faced extreme legal vulnerabilities. The original empire was built on Manhattan dirt. The trusts were governed by strict local laws. To secure the child's claim to the family fortune, the baby had to be born on American soil. They needed to return to New York, and they needed to do it immediately. Only the absolute best would suffice for the King of Manhattan. Astor booked passage on the maiden voyage of the most luxurious machine ever built by human hands, the Titanic. They paid an astronomical sum for parlor suites C-62 and C-64. It was a self-contained palace on the water. It featured private promenade decks, gilded furniture, and separate quarters for their servants. They did not travel alone. They brought a small army of aides. His personal valet, Victor Robbins, her private maid, Rosalie Bidouin, a professional nurse, Caroline Louise Endres, to monitor the pregnancy. They even brought his favorite Airedale Terrier, Kitty. On April 10, 1912, they boarded the tender Nomadic at Cherbourg, France. When they stepped onto the deck of the Titanic, Astor was the undisputed sovereign of the passenger list. His net worth of $87 million was greater than the cost of building the entire ship several times over. To the crew, he was a god. To the other passengers, he was the ultimate symbol of American success. He spent his days walking Kitty on the upper decks, smoking expensive cigars, and confident that his wealth insulated him from the realities of the common man. He had spent his entire life buying his way out of trouble. He had bought land. He had bought politicians. He had bought a new wife. He believed he was invincible. But as the Titanic steamed into the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic on the night of April 14, 1912, the temperature dropped to the freezing point. The Gilded Age was about to collide with raw nature. Yet the ice was not the deadliest trap waiting for the Astor family. The real destruction of their legacy had already been signed and sealed in a New York law office. A legal document that would soon force his teenage widow to make a choice so cruel it would tear America's first royal family apart. To escape the toxic gossip of New York, the couple boarded the most luxurious ship ever built, the Titanic. It was April 1912. For John Jacob Astor IV, the ship was not just transport. It was a floating monument to his class, a Gilded Age palace of iron and glass. He booked the most expensive suite on board. It was Parlor Suite C62, featuring a private promenade deck. He traveled with his teenage wife, his valet, Victor Robbins, his maid, Rosalie Bidouin, his nurse, Caroline Endress, and his beloved Airedale Terrier, Kitty. For the first 4 days, the journey was a triumph. The richest man in the world was returning to claim his throne. They dined with the elite. They walked the grand staircase. But on the night of April 14, 1912, the empire of dirt collided with an empire of ice. When the iceberg struck, Astor was calm. He did not believe the ship could sink. It was unsinkable. He reportedly told his wife that the damage was minor. He even joked about it. He took a slice of ice from the deck and showed it to her. He said they were safer on the massive steamer than in a tiny lifeboat. But as the bow began to plunge into the black ocean, the illusion shattered. The order came: women and children first. Astor helped his pregnant wife into lifeboat number 4. He asked the officer in charge if he could join her. He pointed to her delicate condition. But the officer, Charles Lightoller, was unyielding. No men. Astor did not argue. He was a gentleman of the Gilded Age. He accepted his fate with cold, aristocratic silence. Astor stood on the deck. He was calm. He lit a cigarette. He watched the lifeboat descend into the dark. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. A week later, the recovery ship Mackay Bennett found his body. He was barely recognizable. His face was covered in black soot. His chest was crushed, likely by the falling forward funnel of the sinking giant. But his identity was confirmed by the initials sewn into his collar, his gold ring, and the heavy gold watch in his pocket. He had $2,440 in cash on him. It was a fortune for a common man. It was useless to a corpse. But the real tragedy of the Astor family did not happen in the freezing water. It happened in a warm room in New York. It happened when the lawyers opened his last will and testament. Astor was worth over $87 million. By today's standards, that is billions. He left the vast majority of his empire to his eldest son, Vincent. But for his teenage widow, Madeleine, he had designed a very specific kind of prison. He left her a $5 million trust fund. He left her his magnificent mansion on Fifth Avenue. He left her an annual income that would guarantee she lived like a queen for the rest of her days. But Astor was a control freak. He was a man who owned the dirt under people's feet, and he wanted to own his young wife, even from beyond the grave. Deep inside the legal documents, the lawyers found a hidden clause, a clause of pure malice. It was the remarriage clause. The terms were absolute. If Madeleine ever married another man, the trust fund would vanish. The Fifth Avenue mansion would be taken away. The annual income would stop immediately. She would be stripped of every single dollar of the Astor fortune. She would be cast out of high society, penniless and disgraced. This was not just financial control. It was social execution. Astor had used his wealth to buy her youth. Now he was using his death to buy her future. He wanted to ensure that no other man would ever touch his money, his name, or his widow. Madeleine was only 19 years old when her son, John Jacob Astor V, was born. She was one of the richest widows in the world, but she was a prisoner in a museum of a dead man's memories. She lived under the constant surveillance of the Astor family. They watched her every move. They waited for her to slip up. Vincent Astor, her stepson, despised her. He saw her as a gold-digging interloper. He wanted his father's millions back in the family vaults. For 4 years, she endured the isolation. She lived in the massive mansion, surrounded by servants, but entirely alone. The money was there, the luxury was there, but her youth was slipping away. Then, in 1916, she made her choice. She chose freedom. She fell in love with a childhood friend, William Carl Dick. To marry him, she had to sign away everything. She surrendered the $5 million trust. She surrendered the Fifth Avenue mansion. She gave up the Astor name. The Astor family celebrated. They got their money back. The dirt had won again. But for Madeleine, the escape was not clean. The trauma of the Titanic and the public humiliation of her divorce from the Astor fortune had broken something inside her. Her new marriage did not last. Her life became a tragic downward spiral of broken relationships, depression, and prescription drug abuse. She had escaped the gilded cage, but the shadow of the Titanic never left her. And back in New York, the remaining Astors were about to face a new threat. A threat that would do what the iceberg could not. It would dismantle their empire, brick by brick. Chapter 6. Autopsy of an Empire. The freezing waters of the North Atlantic had claimed the richest man on Earth. But the death of John Jacob Astor IV was not the final chapter of this family tragedy. It was merely the trigger for a slow, agonizing self-destruction. The true autopsy of the Astor Empire begins not with a coroner, but with the reading of a last will and testament. When the rescue ship Carpathia arrived in New York, it carried a traumatized 19-year-old widow. Madeleine Astor was pregnant, exhausted, and suddenly the center of global attention. Her husband was dead. His body had been recovered from the ocean, covered in soot, with $2,440 in his pocket. That pocket cash was enough to buy a luxury mansion in 1912, but in the middle of the freezing Atlantic, it could not buy a single breath of air. Then came the reading of the will. This was the moment the public realized that John Jacob Astor IV had designed a final, cruel trap from beyond the grave. He had left an estate worth $87 million. To Madeleine, he left a $5 million trust fund. He left her the spectacular Fifth Avenue mansion. He left her the yachts, the carriages, the staff. It was a fortune that guaranteed a life of absolute luxury. But there was a catch. A single, toxic legal clause. The will mandated that if Madeleine ever remarried, she would lose everything. The trust fund would be instantly canceled. The mansion would be taken away. She would be stripped of the Astor name and cast out into the cold. John Jacob Astor IV had married a teenager, and he wanted to make sure no other man would ever touch his wealth or his woman. He wanted to own her forever, transforming her into a living, breathing monument to his memory. For 4 years, Madeleine lived in this golden cage. She gave birth to his son, John Jacob Astor V. She walked through the silent corridors of the Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by servants who were paid to watch her. The press stalked her. High society whispered about her. She was young, beautiful, and desperately lonely. She was a survivor of the greatest maritime disaster in history, yet she was drowning in a legal contract written by a dead man. In 1916, she made her choice. She decided that freedom was worth more than $87 million. She announced her engagement to her childhood friend, William Carl Dick. The reaction from the Astor family was swift and cold. They did not offer congratulations. They offered eviction notices. The day she married, the gates of the Fifth Avenue mansion closed behind her forever. The $5 million trust fund vanished. She surrendered the luxury cars, the jewelry, the legacy. She chose love over the empire. But the trauma of the Titanic and the loss of her status could not be washed away by a new marriage. Her life deteriorated into a series of failed relationships, severe depression, and prescription drug addiction. She died alone in 1940 at the age of 47. It was the exact same age her billionaire husband was when he stepped onto the deck of the Titanic. With Madeleine out of the picture, the bulk of the $87 million fortune fell to Vincent Astor, the eldest son from the first marriage. Vincent was a different kind of Astor. He did not inherit his father's love for yachts, mansions, or high society. In fact, Vincent hated his father. He hated the Gilded Age excess that had defined his childhood. Most of all, he hated the source of his family's wealth. Vincent knew the truth about the Manhattan dirt. He knew his family had built their empire on the backs of poor immigrants, collecting rent from disease-ridden slums. He looked at the family's real estate portfolio and saw a monument to human suffering. He decided to destroy it. Vincent began a systematic liquidation of the Astor Empire. He sold off the tenement buildings. He sold the grand hotels, including the Waldorf Astoria. He took the cash and invested it in businesses that actually produced things, rather than just waiting for land values to rise. He dismantled the ground lease system that had trapped New York builders for a century. The dirt was finally being returned to the city. Vincent died childless in 1959. He left his remaining millions to his third wife, Brooke Astor. Brooke would become the face of the family's final act. She was a philanthropist who believed that the Astor money was a public trust. She spent the next several decades giving the fortune away. She funded libraries, museums, zoos, and social programs. She wanted to wash the blood and animal grease off the family legacy. But the curse of the Astors had one final cynical card to play. As Brooke Astor reached her 90s, Alzheimer's disease began to destroy her mind. She was helpless. And it was then that her own son, Anthony Marshall, stepped in. He did not protect his mother. Instead, he exploited her. He cut off her funding, leaving her to sleep on a soiled couch in a freezing apartment while he spent her remaining millions. The dynasty that had begun with $25 and 3 flutes in 1784 ended in a sordid Manhattan courtroom in 2009. A son stood convicted of grand larceny, sentenced to prison for abusing his Gilded Age mother. The money was gone. The land was sold. The family was fractured. The story of the Astors is a warning about the physics of extreme wealth. Money does not build an eternal empire. It builds a black hole. It pulls everything and everyone into its center, crushing them under the sheer weight of gravity. The dirt always wins. And in the end, the dirt does not care who owns it. If you want to understand how other great empires collapsed under their own weight, subscribe now.